Hey there, Digging Deeper listeners. We are back with another, and I'm excited, special edition of Digging Deeper. We are going to talk about politics today. Now, this is right on the eve of a big November for us, which there was no mistake as to why we want to put this in your minds and hearts now. I am joined by three special guests, and I will say I am joined by what I'm excited to be fall weather right outside these windows. I saw rain on the forecast. I am so ready to say goodbye to the sun for a little bit. So that's just me. Real quick, rain or sun?
Rain.
Rain, all right.
As far as preference?
Yeah, preference.
Oh, sun.
Oh, yeah, you're a SoCal guy, aren't you?
Yeah.
Wind.
Wind. Okay, yeah. Which
love
goes
the
great
wind.
with rain. So, all right.
No rain, just wind.
All right. Well, agree to disagree, which is something we're going to talk about a lot today on this podcast. I am joined by three very special guests. You know two of them. Tawny, Mark, how you guys doing?
Good.
Good to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Oh, always.
I think.
Yeah, I had to. Nope. Talking about politics, I was like, let's get the big dog on here, right? It's always good. That way the emails don't go to me; they go to Mark. To my far right, I am joined by Jim Brumbach. Jim, how are you today?
Good, I think.
You are all right. Well,
I left your mic up.
while using your mic,
Yes.
The legend. The man, the legend.
Jim is a legend. I can't
The
think
myth.
of somebody that networks more. But Jim, maybe spend a minute or two talking about why we have you on this podcast and what you do in our community.
I meet with civic leaders. Last year, until June, I facilitated 10 groups of civic leaders with 110 people all together from all different dimensions, and a lot of them were political. Dwayne and Lily, our state reps, were involved. We had 5 of our city councilors. We had all 3 of our county commissioners involved. So that's a lot of what I do. Ideally, looking not only to talk with them about political issues, but talking with them about their relationship with the Lord and growing in the Lord.
Wow. So you have meetings with people from both sides of the aisle in those meetings?
Yes, there were about 70% conservative, about 30% are liberal, and then pretty much weekly I go to the Democrat headquarters and the Republican headquarters and talk with leaders from both groups there. And then just in normal discourse, I meet with people, yes, from different political backgrounds, from different sexual backgrounds, from different economic backgrounds, so pretty much the whole gamut of people in Grants Pass and Josephine County.
Jim, your role and impact has been amazing. And why have you chosen that particular approach versus running yourself?
To run for an office, for instance, commissioner, is pretty much a full-time job. City councilor is like a half-time job, and so it limits how much else you can do. I tremendously appreciate and respect people that are in those offices, but I really like having the opportunity to be involved across the board, yes, in the political arena, but also in the educational arena with the homeless situation, with the police and law enforcement, that sort of thing.
Wow. So we got the right person on this podcast. Very informed, very networked. I love to hear it. So I'm going to throw a few questions out to you guys just on the table. Answer as you see fit. But we're talking about politics. And I'd say in my lifetime, I've just seen, and you could probably attribute it to certain political candidates, but we just have seen a rise in the interest and the passion, a polarization, if you will, in our world and politics. And so you see a lot of people get passionate about it in our church. And so I wanted to use this opportunity to really just make sure that we are aligned and kind of how we're viewing politics. But I want to start with you guys. And what would you say you like or dislike the most about politics?
Well, I better just tell my little quick story in a nutshell so you guys will know where I'm coming from, because I'm totally the opposite of Jim. I'm not involved in anything political. My parents were. My mom listened to talk shows like all day long, and they drove me nuts. And then I joined the Army, and when I got out of the Army, I started having babies, and then I was just trying to stay alive and keep my kids alive for 15 years, and I didn't have time to worry about anything else besides learning how to follow Jesus, because I became a real Christian in that time. And so I didn't have energy or brain capacity for politics until my kids were older. So it was just like the 2016 like elections that I even paid attention to for the first time. And I was like, whoa, this is ugly. Like this is messy. And so I've just, Tim, I think you wanted me on here as somebody that doesn't really like care very much about politics, because I so view Jesus as my king and all of this is temporary. And I think it's important. And I so admire people like Jim and Dwayne Stark that make a difference, and they use politics as an arena to share the gospel and to do good things. But it's just so off my radar because I've got so many other things to do and then when I do pay attention, it's just so confusing and ugly and terrible. And then I see Christians fighting about it on social media, and it just leaves a bad taste in my mouth.
Yeah. So. I think you represent the why or so what, or why is this important, that I think a handful of a lot of people in our church probably think. So, yes, that's why I wanted you on this podcast. But, yeah, I would say that 2016 race probably piqued a lot of interest. And, again, from my perspective, that was, 6-7 years ago. It seems like it's really ramped up since then. But, again, you guys have lived a few more years. You've probably seen a few more interesting presidential races. But that one really, my generation, the millennials, it really got a lot of them fired up about politics. So, question to the couch: what do you like, dislike most about politics?
I'm kind of in the middle, physically and literally, between Jim and Tawny. Maybe shift a little bit more Jim's direction, because I am a little closer here.
Right, you are on the
in
couch.
The sense that, God's people can make a difference wherever they are. And so if it is in the civic arena, praise God. And yeah, it's been ugly and terrible, but it's America at least. You know what I mean? It's like I need to be reminded of that at least we can have this problem where there's two political parties, two real legitimate, I should say, political parties, viable. And, and yeah, the tone, the divisiveness is terrible, but at least we have this problem as free Americans. So I think maybe that's what I like most about it. People can actually have an impact. I think what I dislike most is the demonizing and the stereotype where, you're a Republican. So you are a soulless, heartless, racist. You don't really care about people. You don't care about anything. So you just kind of lump everybody into this sort of this. Oh, you're a Democrat. Oh, you are a godless, baby killing, big government. And it's just so. It's so unfortunate that we put every single Republican or every single Democrat into those categories. I think it's very irresponsible and foolish for Christians, especially, to talk that way, because all it does is further alienate the many in those two parties that aren't in those extremes.
Yeah. And we're going to touch on things like that in just a second, a little bit more. But, Jim, I want to get to you. Obviously, the one of us that is most involved in politics, what would you say you like or dislike the most about it?
What I like the most is that we are a constitutional democratic republic. By Constitution, we're governed by the final authority being the Constitution. Democratic in that we are a state where everyone has the right to a voice. In Jesus' time, did people vote? No. Basically, they were a religious aristocracy with the Sanhedrin functioning as a kangaroo court, pretty much manipulated by the high priest as far as I'm concerned. And the average citizen had very little to say about the government, especially with Rome, but also with even Jewish culture. Here, we have a right to a vote, and being a republic, we are voting for people who will represent us either at a city, county, state, or federal level. I love that we have that opportunity, and in a community like this, you really can make a difference. It's kind of hard for us to impact Washington, D.C. from here, although our vote still counts. But here in Josephine County, yeah, you can make a huge difference, and it's nice to know that. What do I dislike? Well, this is kind of coming in the door backwards. I dislike the fact that churches and Christians tend not to take advantage of the opportunity they have through the political arena. And when 4 out of 9 Christians don't vote, we see the state going in a direction that we would expect if it's primarily a non-Christian vote that's directing it.
Wow, that's a great point. So with what you were saying earlier, you said a frustration with politics. I want to hear from all of you guys, and even if you want to expound on that, some pitfalls. Obviously, politics can be very messy. Life is messy as well. There can be some dangers when you get passionate about any topic. I mean, not just politics, but that's what we're talking about here today. So my second question to you all is dangers and pitfalls. The biggest Christian dangers and pitfalls when it comes to politics.
I think culture war, Christianity. I think we should endeavor for a better society and endeavor towards better laws and leadership. But when the main battle becomes seeing people as the enemy, then we're missing the heart of Scripture, because we wrestle not with flesh and blood. I think also the culture war kind of terminology is potentially dangerous, because it makes it, not in everybody, but with some and maybe many, it makes the main mission of the church saving America rather than saving Americans. So that's I think a big pitfall. Yeah, I don't even know that culture war is necessarily a completely bad label, but I'm growing more and more to have some issues with it.
And I agree with you, Mark, making the issues the issue rather than the relationships. When I want to work with a civic leader, very often I'll call them, and especially in the past, they wouldn't even know who I was. And I would say, would you be willing to get together and talk? And I've almost never had someone turn me down. And then I ask, could we meet at the church? Because I say it's private. We won't have other people competing with us. But I also know it's still a setting that they respect. When we get together, I really work on building the relational aspect before the issue aspect. So I say, would you be open to me sharing with you a 3-minute life history? And then you can take as long as you want sharing your history with me. We do that. I've never had anyone turn me down. And then after they share, if they've talked about God, that's something we interact about. If they haven't, I say, gee, I didn't hear God in your story. Is God part of your story? I've never had anyone say, no, he isn't, or she isn't. I have not even had that said either. But at any rate, then we talk about that, and we both have a relational contact with each other rather than an issue contact, and we have a spiritual foundation that we can build upon. And that sets a stage for real dialogue about issues.
Yeah, so they're not sniffing out an agenda when they're talking with you. They understand, hey, this guy really wants to get to know me.
And on my part, I really do want to get to know, and I do understand very often their issue stands much better when you understand what they've been through personally.
Ooh, that's big. I hope people wrote that down, because that's huge. Yeah.
And I think the biggest pitfall I see is when, for Christians, is when they confuse their political, well, kind of what you're saying, Mark, their political party with being part of the kingdom. Like being a Republican and being a Christian are not synonymous. They're two separate things, and it seems like sometimes they get squished together, and people, they can't even, if you were to ask them, they can't even separate them out themselves. And that's the biggest pitfall that I see.
Yeah, I think one way to assess that, there's probably a lot of different ways to assess that, because most of the Christians that you're concerned about would probably say, oh no, I put Christianity over my politics. But let's ask some questions. Like one question would be, are you more unified with people that you share your political views with than Christians who differ in your political views? because unity among Christians is as we talked about this week in our services, is like Jesus says in John 17, it's like of utmost priority, and all through the Scripture is the assumption there's going to be disputable matters that Christians have. It's not that they're unimportant; it's just they shouldn't divide, you know. And so, yeah, I think this idea of truly being a kingdom of God person first, and then, of course, that influences how I vote and how I try to impact the civic political sector, but not this blending where political parties try to co-opt Christianity into, well, it really supports our politics. Mm-hmm. It's very, very dangerous. Though Christian nationalism, which is, I'm really trying to understand it more, I think it's a real problem. I don't know how you feel about that, Jim, or how you would define nationalism from, Christian nationalism, but it seems like it's a complete blending of Christianity and our political agenda, and this country being especially like God's nation.
Yes, it can be. Can be where my view becomes God's view, and this is a view that we ought to have as a nation. At the same time, there is a worldview that is represented by Scripture that ought to be true of a nation. And if Christian nationalism means that, I have a view of what our nation should be like from a standpoint as a Christian. That's good. If, on the other hand, we do co-opt our particular view for the Christian view, for a nation's view, that gets to be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
All right. Do you guys have any others? And we can always, I think dangers or pitfalls is going to come up a few times. So if you guys have another
sure
one.
Love to see a politician say, rather than just, like you hear 99% of the time, completely demonizing their opponent in their speech or their vote or whatever it might be, to say something like, Senator Jones, I sure disagree, with his speech and his politics, but he's a believer in Jesus like I am, and we unify on a lot more than we disagree. They'd probably run that guy out of office probably, because it's so unacceptable, it seems, to say anything that might give support to the opposing.
It happened last week in a state race, not Oregon, where the moderator asked, in conclusion, please say something pleasant about your opponent. And so the one person did say something pleasant about the opponent, and the other person said, well, this guy had a really good father, but I don't know what happened to him.
Oh,
not pleasant.
Was the guy serious? Or
he was, and he really got hammered in the media.
Oh, man. Yeah, Mark, along with you, I remember, I don't know why I was daydreaming about this, but how interesting would it be to see, a state governor race where there's an incumbent governor or whatever, and the other guy says, you know what, this guy has done such a good job about offering us a seat at the table. He listens to us. We honestly we got a good thing going right now. We're just keep with him because good things are happening in our state. And I was like, oh, what would that look like? And
well, if everybody did like Jim was describing and actually put the relationship first, it would be a completely different thing. If everybody put the relationship with the person across from them, regardless of who it was, politics would be totally different.
But Tawny, that's dangerous and vulnerable. Right? That's I say that jokingly, but
I think there's another question to sort of determine this. Do we really follow Jesus first or our politics? Is what do we do if requiring Jesus or following Jesus requires us to reject or disagree with certain views or behaviors of our party or members, of our party? Very dangerous thing to do, because you could get canceled and labeled by your own party. But it's this fear that I can't really speak up about the president or about so-and-so because he's in or she's in my party. But man, the way they what they just said or how they said it or that mischaracterization, like, I don't support that at all. Like, I really think, I don't know, I might be out there, but I think that people would be more respected if they called out their own people, quote unquote, because they, and of course with a good heart, with a good attitude, but because of their Christian faith. I remember one time, one of our younger teachers, who will go unnamed, in a sermon, did two things. Well, there were two illustrations, and they're completely unrelated. One illustration was a caution against, I'll just say, Trumpism, which is the idea of kind of like unqualified, just support, not ever saying anything to critique his tone or his words, whatever. In the same message, the person used Warren Buffett as an illustration of frugality, who I guess he drives a beater Cadillac, or so, I don't know what it is one of his cars.
Right.
And
that idea that a rich guy would drive such a simple car.
well, someone came into my office and was really upset that I would tolerate one of our teachers doing that, because what that teacher did, as this person was claiming, was really throw in for the Democrats, because Warren Buffett is such a donor and such a Democratic supporter, and criticizing Trump really hurts our cause. And I'm like, is this what this has come down to? Like, these two illustrations weren't even related. They're just illustrations, and they're both true illustrations. And I thought, wow, that to me felt like an example of party politics over, what the Lord would have us talk about.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, this could be a pretty deep rabbit hole where you could spend the whole podcast. But I do think that as we are seeing things unfold in our nation, there is a fear or concern that is very deeply rooted in a lot of people that, to where it has kind of, I guess, risen up in their priorities quite a bit, because the fear that if our country just goes this way or that way, the next step is hell.
Mm-hmm.
But all right, well, I want to take a quick step from present and go back a little ways. One of the things, whenever we're talking about a current issue, current topic, I always want to bring it back to Jesus. So, Mark, I want to, keep the needle on you, and I actually would love some conversation about what Jesus's role was with politicians or rulers or leaders. You guys feel free to speak in as well, but Mark figured I'd give you the baton.
Man, I'm no expert on it, but I don't really see Jesus taking on Rome or trying to change the system. I see him like hitting individuals. It's hard to really pinpoint, because it's, as Jim said a minute ago, it's such a different political context than what we live in. And the Jewish leaders were, in a sense, politicians of their particular local area. And of course, Jesus had a lot to say about those clowns. But the thing is, I think his criticism and his critique had to do more with them being the holders of the stewardship of God and truth, scriptural truth, rather than like the politics of it. So I don't see that Jesus, while he honored the law, he encouraged us to obey the law, obey government authorities. I don't see him like, he could have said a lot of things to try to dismantle the man, take down the system, stuff like that. I don't know that he really did that.
I would argue in the final analysis, he was killed from a human standpoint for his stand on issues of the day that really countered the religious leaders. When he went into the temple and overthrew the tables and drove out the money changers, that was a huge political statement. The woe unto yous that he gave to the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the scribes. Yes, certainly a religious statement, certainly a spiritual statement, but also a political statement, because the Sanhedrin and those leaders were the politicians of his local arena. Yes, they were under Rome, but he had no say in Rome. I mean, he did talk about that fox Herod. Go tell that fox Herod. So he wasn't, someone who was just going along with Roman government, but he strongly dealt with what he saw to be the injustices of the political leaders of his day, which was the Sanhedrin, the leading Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes.
Well, I love the story. Was it somebody wanting him to pay taxes, and they went and got the coin out of the fish's mouth, and where Jesus said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. So to me, the way I interpret that, and I don't even know if it's right because I haven't really questioned it, it's just we should do what we should pay our taxes. We should vote. We should do what we can do in our day and time, but that's all temporary, and there's something so much bigger and more important. And so that's just how I've always thought Jesus' view was on politics. So,
And so, yeah, totally hear you. And what I'm hearing from the couch, and what might be the biggest disconnect between Jesus' time and our time, is that the religious leaders and the political leaders were a lot more arm in arm back when Jesus was walking the earth than maybe we would be now. So he definitely had a problem with the religious leaders, and they were more involved with maybe the political.
Well, they were definitely more of a threat to the kingdom Jesus was building. Jesus wasn't building a political kingdom on the earth. He says, my kingdom's not of this world. And so, yes, they were politicians, but they were also the stewards of the religion of God in that time, and stood completely in the way of what Jesus. I think you make some great points, Jim. It's a hard one to really understand, because on the one hand, I think it's true to say he wasn't political, but on the other hand, the Sanhedrin was very much a political body of his day. So yeah, it's a kind of a tough one. But I think the bottom line is he's building a whole different kingdom.
Right. Yeah.
That's bigger than any nation. It's intra-national, all over the world.
Right. Yeah.
I would recommend two books. One by Neil Mammon, Jesus was/is involved in politics. Neil does a lot of lecturing across the United States even today. And secondly, Wayne Grudem's book, Politics According to the Bible, because it deals in a very in-depth way about these questions.
Okay, awesome. Well, and listeners, we will have that on a list attached to our newsletter as well at the bottom, so you don't have to memorize all of those. All right, I want to go on to an interesting question that I have for you guys, and then going to follow that up with Jim kind of giving some insight onto where or how to receive our news and information. But I want to ask you guys all, do believers have a responsibility to vote? And then the counter would be, would it be okay to choose not to vote? I know that for me, kind of growing up, I was maybe more in the ignorant to politics. It seemed like a really big machine, really confusing to me, so I didn't even get my hands on it. But I think a lot of conviction as I got older and was able to vote. And so I definitely take that responsibility too. But I want to know if you guys think that as a believer, you have a responsibility to vote or not. And what would be some factors that lead into that?
I think yes. I mean, I think that our faith should influence every sector of our lives as we intersect into the culture, and this is obviously an important aspect of our culture. It's, as somebody said earlier, I think Jim, it's a privilege that we have that a lot of people don't have around the world, and if we're going to be people of influence, salt and light, it seems like this is one of the ways that we can do that.
And Wayne Grudem would argue in his book, and I would agree with him, it really is a privilege, as you've said, as I've said, but it's also a responsibility. If you look at Romans 13, be subject to the governing authorities, and then later in verse 7, render to all what is due, tax to whom, tax, so on. As citizens in a constitutional democratic republic, it is the duty of a citizen to vote. So if we're to be good citizens as a Christian, then it becomes a Christian duty to vote in that regard. So there are a lot of practical reasons, but there is a spiritual reason where we have that responsibility to be subject to the governing authorities, and our Constitution lays that foundation that it is our responsibility to be voting, which is kind of the entry level for involvement in the political arena.
Well, and I think for me, and this is just going to show my attitude about stuff, but I believe as an American, we have a responsibility to vote. But I almost couldn't vote in the last election after I watched the debate. Like, I was like, I cannot vote. As a Christian, I cannot support either one of these people. But as an American, I still have a duty to vote. So mine's a little bit opposite of Jim's. But
Well, that was actually going to be my bridge into the next question with Jim about where to find information. But with that, so yeah, you look at political candidates on a national level and you're conflicted. But Jim, given what you were talking about, would you say, hey, if you're not going to vote on a national level, at least would there be more of an importance to get involved locally? I mean, would you prioritize national, state, or even just in your community that one would be more important than the other?
And I certainly empathize with what you're saying. It is confusing. There's just, even today, MSN, which I consider to be a more liberal, but not far left liberal source, this came out just a couple of hours ago. The latest sign, Gallup today, revealed that the percentage of Americans who have no trust in journalism outpaces a great deal, fair amount for the first time. 28% of U.S. adults say they do not have any confidence in newspapers, TV, or radio. So if you're looking for information, it's like, I can't even believe what I see in the media arena. So how in the world am I supposed to know what's really going on? And so I do feel on a national level, especially, you kind of have to defer to people who you really do trust, who have some means of getting to primary source information about the candidates and issues. On the local level, that's much easier.
Okay. Yeah, because you had mentioned earlier, it's hard to feel like we're making a difference in D.C., but right here, your voice is one of a lot less than 300 million or whatever in our country. So, but yeah, it can be very what's the word? Yeah, it can be very, trying to think of a sad word, about like what's going on or who to trust and who to listen to. There was a point with all the mandates and stuff, I was like, the only person I can trust on the news is the weatherman, and that's telling you something. But with that, Jim, maybe if you have some resources or even some strategies, and Mark, speaking to this as well, if you would like, well, Tawny too, what are some strategies to acquiring correct information or to get an objective point of view on the pulse of politics in our country?
I think it is important to listen to both sides. I consider NPR, National Public Radio, to be a little more liberal. I like a source like MSN to be more liberal. I check with both each day. I listen as I drive my car to NPR. I also listen to Dan Bongino, who is decidedly right-wing, or Sean Hannity. But to hear both sides really does at least make you think, well, what is going on here? And then to have people you can go to that you do trust because they have checked out things is very important. Dwayne Stark, he's in Texas, but he still follows Oregon politics and certainly national politics. Lily Morgan, someone I really respect. In a local level here, you can talk with your commissioners, you can talk with the councilors on our city government. So that's a great opportunity we have. Listening to podcasts where they get more in depth, a person like Joe Rogan, obviously, he has a point of view, but he's pretty careful to bring people from both sides. Same thing with Jordan Peterson. So there's some very good podcasts that you can listen to get information as well.
Yeah, Rogan doesn't really care who he upsets, right?
That's right.
Yeah, which is it's refreshing sometimes to get that.
I think sometimes we just have to do a little bit of work,
Yeah.
Which is hard for a lot of us, myself included, because we're busy. Here's a voter's guide. The supposedly is nonpartisan, and came to us here, so you could see where candidates are on very real issues. You can go to their websites, and you could read. Again, you don't necessarily know their character, but you can at least see where they're at on issues, and social issues, economic issues. All of it, and you can make a. Tawny, you bring up a good point when you shared earlier, and I know many Christians share the same view. I could vote for either type thing. Other Christians, and I probably have more this position, would be I can vote for the lesser of two evils. Sorry to put it that way, evils, but since kind of
that's the narrative that's probably surrounded the last two elections, wasn't it? Yeah. The lesser of two evils.
Now, what I have a hard time with, I think is terrible in Christianity, is a disrespect for the person who stays home, for the Christian who says they can't. I may not agree with that decision that you made, but I can surely respect it. And the same thing is true for maybe somebody in your position, Tawny, who might look at me and say, how could you even vote for that person as a Christian and support? Well, again, the quick answer is, in my mind, pick your poison. You get lesser of two evils. And Christians are going to differ on what those issues are. And I think that's even how a person who's in a different political party than you are and a believer, and how they can bring those two realities together. That some of what those evils are going to be maybe differently evaluated in different believers. And while I may not value their priority of evils, I can at least respect, okay, I understand why you voted for them and why you didn't vote for them. You remember the big Wayne Grudem, John Piper debate over this last... Piper said, I'm going to stay home. I'm not going to vote for... I don't know if he said I'm going to stay home. He just says I can't vote for either of the candidates. Whereas Grudem said I can't agree with that position at all. You have to vote for the lesser two evils. Mm-hmm. So,
and it is the case. If we accept the fact that we're all sinful people, at the end of the day, every candidate is the same way. So they are going to have shortcomings that find their way into their politics. And so, once again, it's hard for the individual to ferret that out, and it can be confusing to the point it's disillusioning. I'm just not going to get involved. But almost all of us have friends that we have that really are informed, and we could say, who are you going to vote for and why? Or what do you feel about this issue? I don't get into Washington, D.C., but Nick Stark, Dwayne's nephew, works in Washington, D.C., and he's involved in all 50 of the states because he works for the American Legislative Exchange Council. So I call him once a week, talk a half an hour. Well, most people aren't going to want to do that. But I am a resource that a lot of people come to because they know I do that. I have contacts in Russia. I have someone in Israel. The Debka Files is a great source for news out of Israel, or the Jerusalem Post. So finding people who are well-informed, that you trust their political positions, don't hesitate to question them. But almost all of us have contacts like that.
Jim with the casual, I have contacts in Russia.
I'm part of a business in Russia. If you want to buy it, I'll sell it to you at a really good price.
If you had this podcast on in the background, you heard Russia, and all of a sudden you're wondering how far to rewind back. No, that's really good. And to kind of summarize what I'm hearing, I heard, not to sound like a pastor, 3 R's of voting, right? So we actually have a responsibility. Like, we actually have to get our hands dirty and do some work. I have a friend, very educated, went to school for politics and government. But when I ask him a question, he goes and does the research, right? He reads a stat and then he follows the source, and he'll go to that source's source. And so that's been a great thing for me to see, that there's an actual responsibility. If you don't know something about it, learn something about it. Check the sources. I heard responsibility, respect, and a relationship. And those are the 3 things that sound like it's really important to have a relationship with people. You kind of said a cuss word to a lot of people, and it didn't get emphasized too much, but that idea of disagreeing with Christians that vote differently or that in a different party. And we were talking about it before. To some, that's not even a thing, but it is. And we can't lose that relationship or disrespect them for a differing in opinions. And I think that's so important. I think personally that if you do have a friend that thinks differently, what a great opportunity to enter into a relationship and learn from them, and maybe share some of your light with them as well.
Yeah.
Or for some of your knowledge and understanding. So.
I do think it's worth pointing out, Jesus, you guys know this, he had a tax collector and a zealot on his same team. So was that strategic? Obviously he's trying to build something that's eternal, that is, maybe those guys had an impact in their 2 areas, and Jesus was simply saying, I'm bigger than any political party here, for Rome, against Rome. Let's go. Let's build it. Let's build my kingdom.
Well, and really, how does it look to the world if Christians, Republicans and Democrats, if they divide and quit loving each other because of a disagreement over something that's going to last 4 years? Like, we have this we're part of an eternal family, and if we let some temporary earthly thing divide and separate us, how strong is our love? I think we lose focus of that when we get all caught up in the passion of politics. And just to be clear, I did vote, but when I saw the vice presidential debate, I'm like, okay, I can pick between those two. So anyway, just clearing that up. What were you gonna say, Jim?
I think it's so important where we do have disagreements to find a way of resolving that relationally. I was attacked in social media here just a couple months ago for a position I took. It would be really, I think, a mistake for me to attack back on social media. I got together.
Nothing bad ever happens with that, Jim. You're good.
I got together with a person, talked it over. You just have to keep it personal or it just goes crazy.
Yeah, and I want to stay on this topic because, man, I just basically want to say that 1,000 times. If you get into something on social media, reach out to the person, phone call, face-to-face, whatever. I would 99 out of 100 times it's gonna, maybe not that much, but it's gonna go better than it would over social media. But I do want to spend a few minutes talking about what it looks like, and whether it's personal experiences or strategies, what it looks like for you guys to enter into healthy discussions with people you disagree with. And I'm going to say specifically to the political nature. I think this can probably be applied across the board, but what have you guys found works or doesn't work?
Obviously listening. James 1:19, quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry. Like, okay, you have that view. Tell me about it. How'd you get there? And at the end of the conversation doesn't mean I'm convinced or that he's won or she's won me to their view, but I can maybe have a better understanding of why they think that.
Well, and I think big picture, like Jim was saying earlier, it's so good to listen to different viewpoints, because I know my kids were all liberal for a while and I was trying to figure them out. And so I was listening to some liberal podcasts and I was really surprised at how compassionate the people's ideology was, and the reasons that they saw things the way that they did really surprised me. And I got a completely different perspective than I had ever had before, because I'd never been exposed to that before. So I think we can do it in a bigger picture through podcast and media, listen to both sides of the story. And then, but then, like you were saying, in real life too, sit down and talk to people. Don't just assume you know where they're coming from and why they believe what they believe. Actually ask them, because they usually have good reasons. Even if you don't agree with their methodology, a lot of times their hearts are in the right place.
It's just so easy to be discipled by cable news, and there is no such thing as like a central cable news. I mean, it's too bad. You should try to do that, Jim. Try to build a central cable news. But no, the tragedy of that, it wouldn't fly because it's just too boring. Because cable news creates enemies. You have to have an enemy. You have to turn minors into a major. You got to create a major. You got to make major issues every broadcast. So it's not that the things they're saying aren't true. Sometimes they're not true. But they're truths that just get spun into these big old like enemies. They have to create fear, and they have to create enemies. And so then, like what you're saying, Tawny, you actually sit down and talk to somebody on the other side than you, and you're like, you know what? You're not like the evil person that they just said that you were on 8 o'clock.
Yes. I think to listen and then to continue your alliterative trend with the 3 R's, the 3 L's, listen, love, where you talk about relationship and really come to care about the person. And it just can't help but happen when you get to know someone that you do bond with them. And then third, to learn. Mm-hmm. I found the best way to build on that relationship is when I actually realize they have a point of view that I disagreed with, that I was wrong about or that I need to change. And when they see that I am learning from them, they open themselves to listen and to learn and to love me as well. And it's not just a good way to do politics. It's really an important way to live and to grow as a Christian and to share as a Christian, because it lays a foundation for sharing on that spiritual level that we all want to get to.
Yeah, I might have shared this on a Digging Deeper before, but I realized how many conversations I enter into with somebody about a topic that we disagree on, and I haven't even gone into the conversation thinking I could be wrong, right? I'm like convinced I'm right, and I'm thinking about how to convince them that maybe they could change their thinking, but it's like, oh, it's a dangerous thing when you realize, all right, what if I could learn something, right? What if I could apply to one of those L's? And you do that, and it's fascinating because you actually learn and you grow, and you take those walls down. And I think that's a bigger celebration. I really think that the kingdom is rejoicing when people can really just be in unity and disagree, but do it lovingly and hear each other out.
Well, you guys are reminding me of a podcast, and I hope I can remember it right, but they were talking about levels of thinkers and ability to think. And the lowest level was, I know what I know, and it must be right. And then the next one was, well, maybe I'm wrong. And then the highest one, and I don't even know if these people know what they're talking about, but it was really thought-provoking. But the highest one was, you have something that I can learn from. Yeah. And that's just such a better way, like you're saying, Jim, in all areas of life to live, just interacting with people, thinking maybe that you can teach me something I don't know yet, instead of coming into it thinking I already know everything and I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So when Christianity, like it is today, is getting, rightly or wrongly, probably both. Oh, sorry.
I just want the people to hear the good word.
Yeah, so when Christianity is getting lumped into, let's just say, the Republican Party, then there's this mentality that people, then they think, without what Jim just said, listening, loving, learning, without that attitude and us really trying to go the Jesus way with people, without that, they're just going to keep thinking that Christianity is like, we're trying to change your behavior and we're better than you and what's wrong with all you people, and just a really condemning, kind of a moralistic, unloving approach, and I think that's what's really hurting the body of Christ.
Something that's important, I think, in terms of just learning and growing politically, but in every area, and particularly for people that are old like me. I'm 76, and right now at our house we have 5 people in their 20s, and they're all very well informed about issues. One of them is a writer for Epoch Times, which is a international news agency. One of them is a policeman here locally. One's a college consultant. One's in the medical profession, and one's in a math work within an industry. But just to talk with them about issues. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And listen to them. It's so important to hear what younger people are saying today, because they're on the cutting edge of our culture in a way that I never can be.
That's a good word. Well, we're kind of wrapping up on time, but there's a few questions I still wanted to get to, but I think they lead to another podcast length. I know a lot of people maybe on the other side of the lens are like, well, what about this idea of the single issue voters, right? What about candidates that endorse this or don't endorse that? Because that's a really good discussion. But I want to leave you guys with a final opportunity to just share anything maybe that you didn't get to in the last 45 minutes or so, if you guys have anything.
I really long to see the church and pastors in particular, church leaders, be able to speak into the issues of our day that, yes, is gospel-centered, is biblical-centered, but actually gets into the practical issues. I went to the Pregnancy Care Center banquet on Friday. Lily Morgan was the MC, and during that, she gave about 5 minutes why she's supporting Christine Drazan for governor, and she did it beautifully. It's really hard to do something like that right. I've seen you do that talking about the issues of our day, But people are longing for that. And I know it really can polarize and people can leave the church over that sort of thing, but there's a way to do it that's really powerfully needed in our culture today, because I view our culture as dying because we aren't getting into these issues and we aren't salting and bringing light to them.
Yeah, that's good, because that can be very sticky sometimes, right? And even if you do it perfectly, you're going to get those emails. But yeah, that's
yeah.
good.
I mean, I don't know if what I'm about to say is the opposite of that, but it surely maybe creates a fuller conversation. So, like from my perspective as a pastor, and even like taking a church position, let's say on a candidate, which I guess we're not even allowed to do, legally for a church to endorse a candidate. But we all know that a lot can be said and done from a church's perspective and from a pastor's perspective to endorse or align behind a certain political party or candidate. I guess the thing I've been thinking of, challenged by recently, Andy Stanley in his book, which I'll mention here at the end, is helpful on this, that if I go in and endorse somebody publicly, if the church endorses someone publicly, then the thing we have to keep in mind is the alienation of 50%. Let's just say it's a 50-50 vote, like the nation's pretty much divided, right? So you pretty much alienate 50%, potentially alienate 50% of the nation for the opportunity to share Jesus with them. Jesus said, "Go into all the world, make disciples," and if you go in and support someone like this, I guess you run the potential of, Paul says, I want to be all things to all men so that I can save some. So I guess that's my concern. I remember, you'll remember this, Jim, I got really involved in a criminal justice levy emphasis years ago.
That, yeah.
And I don't think I would do that again. And it's not because I didn't believe in what I was doing. Actually, I probably would do it as an individual, but I actually allowed the church maybe to get more behind it. And I saw people get alienated who had a different view, respectfully, than I did. And I think it was somewhat of a stumbling block for the gospel. Probably not everybody would agree with me on that, because I think my endorsement did some good. But I don't think it was worth it in the sense of people missing the opportunity because of the offense of the gospel. So that's just an example from my perspective.
My concern with that would be similar to Mark's, in that people tend to, it's easier to get caught up in politics sometimes than it is to follow the Lord, because it's human beings that we can see and news we can watch, and it's already a distraction. And so if the church gets more involved in that kind of way, my concern would be that it would confuse people even more to the differences between politics and God's kingdom. So, because I always prefer it personally, just as a church goer, when the pastors just point us back to the Lord and, remind us that we're part of His kingdom and we should be following Him. So.
And I understand the difficulties that both of you are talking about, and they're very real. The Great Commission, go and make disciples, and then teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. The gospel touches all areas of life. It's so hard, but it must be done, where we give a biblical-based approach if we are going to take a position on an issue or a candidate, where that becomes very clear that this is a biblical worldview issue or candidate, and the way in which we deal with it is clear. And yes, still there will be some alienation.
Well, right, and because there's a number of biblical issues that are also political issues. So to go silent for fear that we're going to offend somebody and miss the right to share, that would not be a good attitude for me or anybody to have. We have to teach the Bible on family, on sexuality, on all these issues, poverty and race and life, and all those are very biblical topics. And some people will sort of decry, like, "Oh, you're getting political." And I'm just kind of teaching the Bible. But so yes, I agree. There's a time to make a stand, teach what God's word says. I think been wrestling personally with like endorsements, and how how far to go as like a church on things like that.
Yeah.
Personally, no problem. As an individual, no problem. But
So we can all come ask you, like, on an individual basis.
Yeah.
Who should we vote for, Mark?
well, I'm going to say, well, Jim told me.
Well, it seems like, and as we wrap up, the levies or maybe the bills, more movements, that might provide a little easier of an on-ramp to speak into as opposed to like candidates, because in today's world, you can find dirt on any single person. And the moment you endorse a candidate, those on the other side are going to be like, wow, you endorse this guy who flipped off a camera when he was 12 or something like that. But it seems like it's a fine line, but
I think I over-spiritualized criminal justice levy. Like I try to take a little stronger of a position like this is like the right thing for the church to do, and I just don't know that I can honestly intellectually support that, like truly biblically. It's we can agree to disagree on that, and there are a lot of Christians that didn't agree on that. So.
Is that the one where you got a letter from across the country, like a church in West Virginia or something?
Oh yeah, I was on like I was
Wild.
yeah, crazy. Don't you
did
have
it. You
anything
made-
better to talk about than Grants
Made
Pass?
the news. Well, I have really enjoyed this podcast. I do want to wrap up. Jim, you've said them before, but if you could drop the names of those books again, this is our resources time. I believe you mentioned 2 books.
Yeah. Neil Mammon, Jesus was/is involved in politics, and Wayne Grudem, Politics According to the Bible.
Okay, and you got one here, Mark.
Andy Stanley, Not in It to Win It. Why choosing sides sidelines the church.
Okay, good stuff.
Interesting.
And as usual, I have no
The Holy
resources.
Spirit, I believe, is who you
Is
are.
that your
gonna-
answer, Holy Spirit?
No,
I
that's
would
what-
never say that. That's Tim.
And we'll have these voters' guides somewhere around out in the lobby, underneath the counter in the lobby or something.
Well, listeners, if you have any other questions, dig deeper at rivervalleycc.org, and I can totally get it to one of these 3 or do my best to answer it, but that's always a coin flip. You guys, Jim specifically, thank you very much for joining us. I hope this isn't the last time to have you guys on.
Well, and thanks for all you do, too. You make a big
Absolutely.
difference.
Yes.
And of course, it's only possible with the background of the church, with just a political voice without the biblical background goes nowhere. So thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah. All right, listeners, gear up for November. It's going to be a wild one. We will join you here in a few weeks with our next Spiritual Discipline, Dig Deeper podcast. Until then, have a great day.